Risk takers may change the world, but when it comes to staying informed, why gamble with your news? That's why I use Ground News. It's not another echo chamber or algorithm-driven feed. It's a powerful tool that brings together over 30,000 articles a day from across the political spectrum. Ground News doesn't want to be an arbiter of truth. They want to help readers analyze news coverage through direct comparison. For example, their blind spot feed highlights news events receiving disproportionate coverage on one side of the political aisle, so you can discover important stories you might otherwise be missing. Visit ground.news and see for yourself, and if you like what you find, use my link in the show notes for 15% off any subscription. You'll be supporting this podcast and investing in a future where diverse perspectives are the norm. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And in the race to revolutionize space travel, electric vehicles, and even human longevity, startup entrepreneurs, often the bold Silicon Valley archetype, are pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But what separates the visionaries from the merely reckless? How thin is the line between genius and delusion? And what motivates someone to bet their fortune, even their life, on an idea? Our guest this week returns to the show to explore these questions, discuss his latest projects, and reflect on some of his own life-changing risks. Ashlee Vance is a feature writer at Bloomberg Businessweek, host of the innovator-focused travel show Hello World, and the New York Times best-selling author of 2 books. The first, Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. And most recently, When the Heavens Went on Sale, the misfits and geniuses racing to put space within reach. That book was the inspiration for the new HBO documentary, Wild Wild Space, which is now streaming on Max. Ashlee, thanks so much for joining us again.
It is my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad. It's a pleasure all around. You began your career as a writer for the British-based technology news site The Register in 2003.
Yeah, I started with some technology trade publications really early and then went to The Register.
In our previous conversation last year, talking about your career as a writer, you said, quote, "As I was working my career up, I started in technology trade publications, covering extremely nerdy things like data center storage and semiconductors, and really the fundamental layers of the tech industry. And then you said, quote, when I went to places like the New York Times or The Economist, I was always the person who covered the geekiest stuff. The editors, they would always tell me at the Times, we're going to put this on the back of the business section because nobody's going to read about this open source programming language you've discovered," end quote. And then on July 17th, 2024, your documentary Wild Wild Space is on HBO, displayed right next to Game of Thrones. So thinking back to the beginnings of your career, Ashlee, how did you feel that day?
Give me PTSD. Yes. No, it was an awesome moment. And the Game of Thrones thing it was pretty crazy to turn on my television and just see it there after all this work. You know, it's funny. I mean, careers are strange things. You look around and some people seem to hit it big overnight and some people go on these journeys. And I feel like I've been on a journey that's been these different steps along the way. And I've done the reporting and then I did some books and then found my way into this film universe. So anyway, to have my first film up on HBO was just crazy. I feel like it's been building, it's all kind of similar work that's just been going in these different directions, but it felt good.
Looking back over the course of your career, was it just a series of in-the-moment decisions of transitioning from technology writing to larger publications like The Times to video production with Hello World and the biography of Elon Musk? Was there any long-term plan that you had from the get-go, or was it just following your passions and things that interested you?
It was really haphazard in a lot of ways, although I'll tell you a story, which is true. My wife will verify this. We met in college.
We will check with her afterwards for our audience just to confirm this story.
Yeah, we met in college. I was probably around 19 years old, somewhere around there, 19 or 20. And I was a philosophy major. I wouldn't say I had a lot of very clear job prospects. And anyway, I was trying to charm this beautiful, magical woman to pay attention to me. And she remembers, and I remember, I said, I'm going to write a best-selling book. I'm going to have a travel TV show. I have no idea who actually proclaims something like that. And I'm going to make movies. And I remember vaguely believing that I was going to do all these things. I don't know, why I believe that. To really answer your question before, when that movie came out, it was the culmination of 26 years of work and wandering to actually be the last piece of that goal. I've written a best-selling book. I have a travel TV show called Hello World, and this movie was the last piece. And so I don't know, you can sit down and be like, okay, I had this plan. These were obviously things that were stuck in my head, but then there's been turns along the way where it feels like a lot of luck and chance was involved. You mentioned I wrote at the Register. It's this very sarcastic, it was like one of the first blogs. I mean, it's very internet first and forward. And I went straight from there to the New York Times, which it's common now. But when I did that around 2008, it was not normal to go from somewhere like the Register to the Times. And, I wrote this biography on Elon Musk, which I like to think I kind of made some of my own luck by being very persistent and spotting that this was a really interesting story. But things had to go my way for that to work out and for the timing to work out. And so I don't know, there's kind of a master plan on some of this stuff. And then these urges of what I wanted to do were always lurking back there, and life has helped push me toward them at times.
So you predicted what you were going to do in your career at 19, and then you hit all of those milestones over the next couple of decades. I know that this is a word that some people run from, especially in the startup space that you cover so frequently, while others, maybe the Chris Kemps of the world, embrace it. Would you call yourself an ambitious person?
I think so. I think in my day-to-day life, everyone always says I'm laid back and kind of easygoing. And I think that is my normal operating procedure, especially interacting with other people. But then I don't want this to sound in any way like patting myself on the back or something. It's just it takes a lot of work. I mean, I think if you didn't have a certain amount of ambition, some of the stuff would not get done. And then it's something like ambition combined with curiosity and just passion. I get interested in these stories and then I feel compelled to tell them. Like on the movie, the documentary, I'm sure some people make money making documentaries, but this was not really a money making enterprise. I mean, it took me 7 years. I actually lost money doing this. I mean, the only reason I did it was because I felt like I wanted to tell the story and see the movie get made. And so, yeah, I don't know. Is that ambition or is that insanity? I don't know. I don't know what that is. But, there is a part of me that I tend to take on a lot of projects at the same time and charge after them pretty full on.
Yeah, I've found just from talking with people that curiosity and ambition are really intertwined. I feel like curiosity is the engine of ambition. You have to get curious about something first, and then that kind of allows for ambitious goals.
Even though I said I had all those goals in college, which I think it was genuine, and I did, I obviously had no idea how to achieve them. I wasn't really sitting there being like, I want to write a best-selling book to be a famous author or something. I loved writing. That seemed like the best outcome you could have if you went after that, And when I was making the travel TV show, it's like a lot of people watch it and it is successful, but it's not like I'm not like some household name. And I just love it's probably the thing I do that requires the most work and effort, and I just love doing it. I don't think I really have these end goals and accolades in the back of my head. It's more just what I get interested in, and then really, if you're going to get interested in it, you might as well do it right, I think.
Might as well go whole hog, as they say.
Yeah.
You say in Wild Wild Space, which we'll get to more in a moment, that you, quote, stumbled into space just by reporting on SpaceX, end quote. Was your earliest reporting on the company your 2012 cover story for Bloomberg Businessweek titled Elon Musk, the 21st Century Industrialist?
It was 2012. That means SpaceX is about a decade old. I was just not covering SpaceX or space in any way, shape, or form, and had missed those formative years of the company completely. And a lot of people, as I've been doing the movie, reporting a book. They have space in their blood from the time they're a kid. And
That's a deadly condition. You got to look out for that. Space in the blood.
it's dangerous because you get caught in this world. And it's pretty common to meet someone who was dreaming about the stars and space from a young age. That was not me at all.
Right. So that story for Bloomberg led you to write your 2015 biography on Elon Musk. So that's over 3 years writing about SpaceX, or being within its orbit, pun intended. So you stumbled into writing about space. Okay, I buy that. But it's 12 years after that Bloomberg piece, 9 years after the Elon book came out. So what kept you in space?
It was timing on that one. When I did the biography on Elon, for sure, my favorite reporting was about SpaceX and about the early days I had missed, which stinks because you can't witness it firsthand. And a lot of my best reporting, I think, does come from this firsthand knowledge. But it was from piecing together all these stories from the people who had lived through it. And it just sounded amazing. I mean, I don't know if people know this, but the first SpaceX rocket, the Falcon 1, was built on this island in the Pacific, Kwajalein. It's kind of roughly between Australia and Hawaii. And it was like the Gilligan's Island of building a rocket. It's just a bunch of 25-year-olds stranded in this spot for years. And so I love those stories. And then right when I finished the book was this moment in time when SpaceX had been around long enough and had enough success that suddenly commercial space, private companies doing the stuff which people had dreamed of for decades and had never worked. Suddenly it was like, okay, SpaceX has done this. Maybe we can do this too. And so I started seeing rocket companies all over the world and satellite companies all over the world. And I did try to resist. I told my wife, I'm not going to write my next book about these people. I do not want to be a space reporter. I cover all kinds of things. And then I couldn't escape it. It was just too exciting to follow these people on their journey. So I just got sucked right back in.
Just as an aside, based on something you said, that it was just the way you said it, that it stinks that you missed the first 10 years of SpaceX. I felt that twinge of regret. Is there someone who is no longer alive that you wish you could have been alive to cover? And is it John Paul Stapp?
Oh, John Paul Stapp would be up there. The person I would love to cover, yes, Emma Goldman, this anarchist from the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Her writing had a big influence on you.
Big influence, just one of these outsized I love, most of my reporting is about eccentric people chasing some strange life, a different life, than the rest of us lead. And I don't really know that we've seen a figure quite like her since. And I think it was like this very different time when America could have gone down a different path. Anyway, we could get into that if you want. But yeah, Emma Goldman, and then John Paul Stapp is this incredible figure. I would have loved to have covered him.
Wild Wild Space chronicles, quote, the land grab for low Earth orbit. It largely follows the founders of 3 companies, 2 that make rockets and 1 that makes satellites. There's Peter Beck of Rocket Lab, Chris Kemp of Astra, and Will Marshall of Planet. And you cover these companies and others in the book When the Heavens Went on Sale, which came out last year. We discussed that book in our first conversation. So how would you describe Wild Wild Space as it compares to your book?
It's similar but different. As you mentioned, all those characters are in the book. The book has more characters. So this is a more confined story. And obviously it's a totally different medium where some of the things I wrote about in the book, you get to see happen right there on the screen. So it was a more condensed story. This one really hones in on one of the stories from the book. There's this Silicon Valley NASA center called NASA Ames, and there were a group of friends who went there in their 20s and were doing quite unusual things for a NASA center, actually trying to bring the cost down on technology they were developing and trying out some new ideas. And they formed this friendship. They went on to found these companies that we feature in the film. And so some of that was like the heart of the movie. And I started this project on my own and then ended up joining up with director Ross Kaufman, Oscar winner. He came on to the project. It really looked at all the footage. I had hundreds of hours of footage with a lot of different characters. And this was also the story that he came back to and wanted to focus on. And it was the original story that inspired me to do the book. And so it wasn't even sad for me to whittle down, excise some of these characters. I knew that this really was the heart of what had got me into this mess in the first place and was a story worth telling.
You began making Wild Wild Space almost 7 years ago. I think I have that right.
Yes.
So had you already started the process of writing When the Heavens Went on Sale? What's the chicken and egg there?
I'd started the process of reporting the book. Basically, what happened is I came out of doing the Elon biography. I was getting interested in these rocket companies and satellite companies. I started to get the feeling there was probably a book. As I mentioned, resisted that urge, but I kept covering the people nonetheless. And then all these doors started to open for me. The book had done well enough that I built sort of like a reputation in this community. And so I was granted access to places you're not usually allowed. All this stuff is quite government controlled. Many of these companies like to keep themselves secret until the last moment possible, but they were all letting me in. I was going on trips to India. I was like the only reporter allowed to sleep near the rocket and go to the mission control, all these things. And so I was reporting this out, and then I realized my access was so good, and I had been making my television show, Hello World, alongside all this. And I said, why not? Let's try to make a movie at the same time. And so I raised some money and started bringing cameras along with me as I was doing the reporting. Initially, I really wanted to do a huge series across the globe. So that's why I had all these hundreds of hours of footage, because I filmed in India, New Zealand, Ukraine, Alaska, everywhere, and got in over my skis. First movie I'd ever made. I discovered I didn't really know how to make a series. I didn't have enough money to make a series. And again, that's kind of why I partnered with Ross Kaufman later on. But that's how it happened. Yeah, it was just this idea to see if you could do a book and a movie at the same time.
Kind of reminds me of reading Walter Murch's In the Blink of an Eye book on editing, and how he was brought in to go over thousands of hours of footage that Francis Ford Coppola got for Apocalypse Now.
Right.
And craft a narrative from all that footage. I mean, was that largely the role that Ross played? Was there any filming involved once he came on, or was it about finding the story within all the footage that you had already acquired?
He had to find the story first. It was Ross. I've got this wonderful producer, Jay Callahan, and this incredible editor, Hypatia Porter, she really had to go through a lot of this footage as well. It was finding the story first. I had run out of money. We could get into all the drama of what it's like to make a documentary. We had missed moments of filming. I would just pay out of my pocket to try to capture some key things. And then I ended up selling it to HBO and getting more money. And then Ross came on, and we did have a chance to film for a couple more years after that.
I've kind of stayed away from ever even considering getting into documentary filmmaking for this exact reason.
That's the right call.
Making a fictional movie with a script is already difficult enough. I mean, I guess it must have been a relief to have someone who did not have, and I'm using this word empathetically, the baggage of having filmed so many hours across so many different continents, someone who could look at that footage objectively and say, okay, here's where I think we should go. I imagine it just has to be difficult to have gone through all of that, filmed all of it, and put your heart and soul, I bet, into every inch of footage that exists. Using an analog term, I don't think you can measure digital footage in inches, but hopefully you follow me there. It must have been a painful process having to set so much of that aside.
It was a huge relief. Yeah, it was one of the peak moments of the last decade of my life. A bunch of things had happened. I mean, one is that I'd gone through so many ups and downs on this project. Like I mentioned, financially, every network had already turned me down once when I'd gone around trying to pitch this before. So it had felt dead, right, at different times. And I was quite determined not to let it fully die. I had to write the book in the middle of doing this. It's a 500-page book. That was quite a bit of effort. In the middle of it, you're trying to keep these relationships going with people. I felt like I looked pretty foolish at parts of this where it's like, I promise I'm going to do this thing. You will see it one day, I swear. And then after having done the book, I had spent so much time thinking about this and just immersing myself in this world that you're both tired and you've lost perspective completely on what does the average person know about this world? What do they care about? And so when Ross and Jay and the rest of the team came on and had these fresh eyes, it was amazing. And then just to have people who had done this before, it was like, okay, you have the energy that we need and you know how to actually see this through to the end. So no, it was one of the happiest days of my life.
Sounds like it. Your first season of Hello World was 2016, right?
Yes.
I imagine when you first started the process of filming for this, there had to have been a part of you that was like, all right, I've done Hello World. I know how the documentary thing goes. I know how to craft a story, even if it's a shorter one, 20, 25 minutes long. What was it that once you began filming for this that you realized, okay, this is a different beast entirely?
Well, you're totally right. Especially on Hello World, we have a team, and I don't want to take credit away from anyone, but I produce a lot of that show and direct it and host it and write it. So yes, it's like, oh, I know how to do this. I think some of this was just the logistics and the mechanics of making a documentary. I mean, I actually think I would have done a decent job if it had been a really smooth ride, but it's you have to keep money going through these things. COVID happened in the middle of it, which put this huge pause on these companies. It's a really long journey. And I made a fatal mistake, which was I did not have enough money to do a series, but kind of thought I could. And got to the point where we filmed all this amazing stuff. It was like you were just kind of halfway done. And there needed to be more money, a new approach, and all of that. And so that's when I had to shift gears to making it into a film. So I don't know, I've learned a lot. I just completed a second movie where I worked with the incredible director, Chris Smith. That's going to come out on Netflix probably early next year, about the longevity guru, Brian Johnson. We followed him all last year, and it was a totally different experience. Largely, again, Chris is a brilliant filmmaker and knows exactly what he's doing. But that was straight shot, like 9 months, start to finish, and on budget. And I feel like I learned a lot through doing this.
I wouldn't be doing your philosophy major justice if I didn't ask a more introspective question here. You mentioned in our first conversation last year, you said, quote, if I'm being honest, and you were speaking here of something you said earlier about how there were these people all around the world who were giving you access to their companies, oftentimes very secretive companies that most people wouldn't have access to. And you said, quote, if I'm being honest, I think it was probably some of the shine of the Elon book. And there was probably something quite flattering about having this reporter toting along just in case you ended up as the next Elon Musk, quote. So what I want to ask you, Ashlee, it isn't a question about access, but a question about perception. What is it like for you to be in the presence of someone who perceives themselves to be, by the very nature of them inviting you to document them, an important figure? And how do you feel in those moments as you're aware that you are being perceived as the biographer of important people?
I mean, I know exactly what you're getting at. It really is a deep question. It gets to a lot of things about this relationship between a journalist and a subject and your own self-perception and all these things. I mean, the movie's kind of an interesting example, I think. The three characters that you mentioned, I would say I probably had a different relationship. It is true that universally that book and my reputation opened doors, but I think each one of those people had slightly different motivations and relationships with me as we went. Chris Kemp is clearly the most flamboyant, eccentric character in the film, the CEO of this company, Astra. And I would say the one who quite clearly has the most yearning to be, I think, seen in that sort of Elon kind of level. And the way that equated in the film was he gave us the most access and let us film absolutely everything. And the bet on his part was that things were going to work out. And I think we had actually a very, I don't know if you'd call it a transactional relationship. It's very clear what the deal was. It's just kind of this is what I'm hoping to get out of this. This is what you're hoping to get out of this, which is, this unvarnished look at what's going on. And I think we knew how we saw each other. Peter Beck, who's his rival at Rocket Lab, this New Zealand rocket company, he is by nature, Kiwis themselves are sort of a bit more modest and less patting themselves on the back or anything like that. And it was harder to pull some things out of Peter. I always got the sense that he really kind of wanted to let go a little bit more, but sort of couldn't, but still wanted to be part of this, right? And still, he didn't want just Astra to be getting the story. He knew that his company was kind of more successful. And so I don't know. You're balancing all this out. There's this great book, The Journalist and the Murderer, about this relationship between reporter and subject. And it is one of the strangest. It is just not a normal relationship. It is not like anything else you will experience in life, because everybody during these long projects is always weighing the pros and cons of what's going on, and sort of like, are we friends? Are we not friends? Is this exactly what's happening here? And everybody's trying to get something out of it, and everybody knows that. And it's bizarre. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's kind of what's coming to mind.
I understand in my own small way. I mean, I don't even know if this is an apt comparison, Ashlee, but it's the one I can make. It's like if you're on a dating app and you meet someone on a dating app and then you go on a date with them, right? And so because of how you met, you kind of know what you're both kind of looking for in that moment. But while that's in the back of your minds, you also have to socialize like normal people and try to enjoy each other's company. But there's this kind of awareness of, well, we did meet on a dating app. So I know we're talking like friends right now, but we are both kind of also eyeing each other as potential relationship partners or whatever might be there. And there's this kind of meta awareness. Same thing happens in a job interview. I mean, there's all these kinds of power dynamics at play when you have a certain relationship to another human being. And I have to imagine that in the making of this documentary, or when you were writing When the Heavens Went on Sale, it's kind of like that on steroids.
Absolutely. And things change over time. And it's just kind of like a lot of baggage that comes with it. It's a strange job. My favorite part of the job is that I always try to find interesting people. It's the character that's the most interesting part of all this over the technology or the product. And like we talked about, that's what draws me into this in the first place. But you get to inhabit these worlds, but you're in it for, if I'm doing a magazine story, a few months, or on a project like this for 6 years. And then at the end, it kind of ends. And it's very strange. It's strange to spend that much time with a group of people, probably almost as much as your family during that period of time. And then it ends. And then you have to resize each other up again. They get to see what you did with all this material and how they feel about it. And that dynamic is going to change for some of the people in the book or in the film. And, I'm a human. I mean, people have pretty low views of journalists. I don't ever go into any of these things to like stitch anyone up, because I'm always genuinely interested in the technology and in the people. I'm not a very judgy person. I mean, I find anyone who's a bit different interesting, and I appreciate that somebody takes the courage to live their life in a different, maybe more exotic sort of way. So I try not to be too judgy, but people are going to feel how they're going to feel when you ultimately present that. And I am human, and you feel both pleasure when somebody's happy and you feel guilt when somebody's not. The whole profession hangs on this weird relationship.
I imagine you are familiar with Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Observing a particle alters its position, which means it's impossible to accurately understand or predict its behavior. And a reporter's like that, right? You probably understand better than most that the moment that you enter that relationship as the reporter, or the moment you turn the camera on or the microphone on, the reality that you're trying to capture is fundamentally altered because they're aware of your presence. Is that something that you account for when you're trying to do your reporting? Are there tricks that you use to try and get around that or try to account for it? How do you relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a little different between a book and a documentary in some ways.
Oh, yeah. The camera's probably a big blaring light that lets them know. Yeah.
It's really intrusive, and some people just get used to it and some people don't. And some people have a tendency to ham up for the camera, which is the worst. Whereas, when I do the book reporting, a lot of times people talk about a fly on the wall. I mean, it's kind of what I do. Sometimes I'm interviewing people, and then sometimes I'm just in a corner just listening, and I could be there for hours, and people do really seem to start to forget that you're there. And it definitely feels less intrusive to me than the camera. On this particular project, it was sort of amazing. I mean, like with Astra, the rocket company that Chris Kemp runs, we started filming when it was the very beginning of the company. It was 4 or 5 people in a room. As the company grew to like 50 or 60 people, I knew everybody by name. We had been there so often. I would just walk in the door. Nobody would even really notice that we were there. It's why we have this footage where people can see, like, we're in mission control. A rocket blows up, and Chris, the CEO, is spinning his investors about how it was a good thing on camera. I mean, there's no way to capture stuff like that unless you've earned some of the right to be in the room in that moment. And so on this project, there is plenty of space in the movie, but I think this is one of the rarest looks at how Silicon Valley works, how a startup works, how CEOs operate in this environment, because usually everything you see is very manicured and polished, and companies don't allow you to do things like this. I try to spend enough time, whether it's the book or the film, to try to get to something a little bit closer to truth, because you're exactly right. Otherwise, you're always getting spun a little bit on the journey. It's so funny. Like, people read these magazine profiles all the time about famous whoever, athlete, actor, business person. I've done those stories. There's something really staged about them. Essentially what you do is you call up LeBron James's PR person, or maybe LeBron, and you're like, look, I want to do this magazine profile. And it's like, okay, well, I want to get something a little special for the story. So let's hang out for a day. Like, what's something you would kind of do normally on a day? So you're trying to be normal, but you're spending this like little field trip day together that's completely manufactured and manicured, and it is like a first date. Everybody's trying to put on their best behavior. And so, this felt a lot more real to me than something like that.
As someone who was a Steve Jobs fan, I've heard so much about the reality distortion field. You know, how Steve would kind of just through force of will basically change, or at least lead people to believe that reality around him and around the company was different than what the reality actually was. And I'd never seen it until this documentary. I'd never witnessed someone attempt in real time to create a reality distortion field. And I also found it kind of funny that he had a one more thing slide.
You caught that. Yeah, that's a little, I don't know if it's a full Easter egg, but for the people in the know.
Yeah.
There's a scene that was in the movie for a long time, but I think it actually ended up getting cut from the final version, where Chris just explicitly explains his philosophy on this, and it's like, if you frame a rocket launch explosion as a disaster, it will become a disaster. And he's like, if you frame a rocket explosion as a success, it will be a success. And it's sort of how you believe it. I know some people watch the movie and they think Chris is off-putting to them, and they think he's disingenuous and spinning stuff, and certainly there's a bit of that going on. I also I do think that there is some degree to starting a company, trying to do a documentary for 6 or 7 years, where you got to be lying to yourself and possibly some other people, sort of just not fully lying, but that suspension of disbelief, that reality distortion field. Otherwise, you're never even going to start, I think. And it's always the fine line of whether you cross some lines along the way. But I think that I don't actually fault him for parts of that impulse at all, because I think some of this is what it takes.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't call it off-putting, but maybe I'm used to larger than life personalities like that. But I think if I had to guess at why some people find it that way, is that you probably know this better than most, Ashlee. Like you were saying, that impulse to want to kind of shape reality to your will, because it will affect the stock and the value of the company and its perception. Like, that's something that probably every founder or every celebrity, people in this space do. It's just that usually it's kind of hidden behind a couple layers of social graces, and it's rare to see it that nakedly displayed.
Right. And you usually don't have somebody's camera in your face while you're trying to do it, while your rocket blew up right as your investor calls. No, I think you're right. You said you kind of didn't feel that way about Chris. It's been really interesting, because Chris is I would say probably kind of the star of the movie. And so I get the most feedback about him. And it's a bit of a window into different people's own psyche telling me how they feel about Chris. And it's been pretty fascinating in these last couple of weeks since the movie came out, just to hear everybody has an opinion on him. And it's fascinating to see how people interpret themselves a bit through him.
Speaking of thinking like the founder of a startup, while making the movie, you've said, quote, "You have to convince yourself that something's possible when it seems impossible, just to get through the really difficult times," end quote. And I get that cynicism and pessimism are the killers of big ideas. You have to believe you can do something difficult in order to actually do it. But having watched startup founders up close and having run your own, what you've called a startup of a movie, where do you think the line is between healthy self-belief and setting ambitious goals and irrational self-delusion? Because it feels like there's often a razor's edge separating the two. Where do you think it is?
It's a really hard question. I don't even know if I have a satisfying answer because I've actually been thinking about that myself. You know, my wife, when she was looking at me go through this project, she's like, "You're the most persistent person there's nobody else that would have done this." And then you think, okay, well, it's great because we got to this outcome and it appeared on HBO. It was literally like one Tuesday, everybody on earth had said no to me. I'd run out of money. There sort of was no path forward. And then, like on a Wednesday, somebody I'd pitched it to years earlier asked me what had happened to this project. And I was on the phone with HBO that afternoon and revived these things. And, you know, without that phone call, I mean, we're not having this conversation. Maybe my wife is incredibly upset with all the like money and time I spent on this thing. And so it's hard to know where to draw that line. And then I remember I was tweeting, you know, just again, apologize for like the patting myself on the back, but you're kind of like, you know, remember to be persistent. I put out some tweet about that and everybody's chiming in. And then you sort of wonder if you're leading people astray because how does anybody know? There is undoubtedly on many things, there is time to throw in the towel and go, you know, cut your losses and go chase after something else. So I don't know. I think this is one of those giant life questions that all I know from my experience is just that if it's important to you and you see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, you might as well keep going. But I don't know how it feels to you. It just feels almost like there can't be some clear line of demarcation on that.
Peter Beck's Rocket Lab, as of this June, has had, I think, 50 successful launches and only 4 failures.
Yeah.
Is there anything that separates an Astra from a Rocket Lab, like a rollicking success from a company that loses 99% of their initial value? Starting any business, as you've noted, is like really grueling, difficult work. You know, most startup companies that you've covered, I'm sure, are filled with talented and ambitious people. But just based on how much time you've spent in this industry and the startup industry at large, are there any commonalities you've found between companies that succeed and ones that fail?
I mean, it is another fascinating question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And like, look, Astra, there's probably 1,000 reasons that have contributed to its very rough road. So let's focus on the success for a second. There's kind of 2 stories that I think of when I think about this. One is that if you look at Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos's rocket company, and SpaceX, they started almost the exact same year, about 20 years ago. And one company has become the world's most successful rocket company and satellite company and built 4 families of rockets. The other has yet to send a single satellite, let alone a human, into orbit after all that time. And so you kind of wonder what's the difference. And then I look at SpaceX and Rocket Lab, the 2 most successful rocket companies. So both of those companies were largely, especially to get off and running off the ground, were a bunch of 20-somethings who had not come from traditional aerospace. They had not been on successful rocket programs before. They were doing this for the first time. And both of those companies succeeded. All around them were other rocket startups that did have people who had worked on successful rocket programs before, but none of those companies actually sent anything to space. And this is a long way of saying that where I previously, I think, underestimated the actual influence that a CEO, the prime leader, can have on a venture, I now am quite convinced that whether you like him or hate him, whatever Elon Musk has is like emanating through SpaceX. And with Peter, he was born to do this. He's a 1 in a billion engineer. He does everything he can.
It's crazy. No formal education, taught himself how to build rockets. It's bananas.
Never went to college. He worked at a dishwashing appliance maker and did this. You know, this was always his consuming hobby on the side. So he's been consumed by this. He was built to do this. He's a perfectionist, and all of that carries through the company. There's no other way to explain it. You know, Rocket Lab built all of its first machines in New Zealand when that entire country has no aerospace industry, let alone Peter having experience at this. And they were competing against about 7 American rocket companies that had all these decades of our aerospace experience in our hands. So, you know, you sort of have to like step back and look at that and think, I suspect Peter had quite a large role in why that happened.
You come from a generation, or no, you come from a couple generations of atheists.
Yes.
And I grew up Christian, but I'm an atheist myself. I've always kind of struggled with missing the meaning that I found in religion while also realizing rationally that I can't believe in something that I don't believe is true. What do you think about and what do you feel when you look at, to quote a phrase that you've used, the heavens above us, the vast beauty of space? What comes to mind?
Well, I've probably been doing this movie too long because I suddenly just pictured a ton of satellites going around, which is not the mystical, magical part of space that I think most of the rest of us feel. I think this goes back to what I was talking about before. I even after doing all of this reporting and this work on this field, I love looking at the stars like anybody else. My mind tends to go to this kind of Jungian collective unconscious sort of idea, and that all our brain waves and souls are sort of mingling up there somehow, almost telepathically. But I do not go to this. I just don't go to that same place that a lot of people seem to go to, of the majesty of it all and the infinite expanse. I have trouble getting my head to that place. And so I probably have like the most cynical, pragmatic view of space that anyone who's dabbled in this for so long could have. I think I've trapped myself a little bit in low Earth orbit. But yeah, I've never, I don't know. Even though I do love writing about this stuff, I don't have that awe. I am awed sometimes when I think about it, but that is not my first instinct. Is that deflating?
I don't think so. I wanted to hear your perspective. There was a recent episode of Hello World in which you traveled to Switzerland, home to, quote, some of the world's most advanced brain research labs, end quote. And you've recently been focusing a lot of your reporting on AI, brain-computer interfaces, and relevant developments in technologies. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy here. One field dedicated to going up and outward and the other inward. Is there one that excites you more? Do you find yourself more drawn as of late to the inner workings of human beings?
Yes. Gosh, you're perceptive as always. Yeah, I know I just spent all this time making this movie and writing this stuff. It's the brain. I'm hooked. That's where I am next. And I've been going to so many startups and labs lately. And yes, I mean, to me, that is fascinating, right? I mean, it's actually our brain that defines our entire reality, and we know how bits of it work, but we do not really know how the brain works. And I find that, I mean, how incredible is that? All the science, all these years we've been living with ourselves, and like the most fundamental thing that defines everything about us remains a mystery, even though it's attached right to us. And I think, based on what I'm seeing, I mean, these things tend to take much longer than you think they're going to, but my goodness, the next 20 years looks pretty fascinating to me. I think we are about to get more data about the mechanics of the human. Well, I know we are going to get more data about the brain than all these millennia put together many times over. And we're doing this at the same time that we're building these incredibly complex artificial neural networks that are loosely, very vaguely kind of based on how the brain works, but some sort of interesting intelligence is coming out of that complexity. And so, yes, I'm buckled in. I'm going to cover this. I'm ready to see what happens. I want to watch the next 20 years unfold.
In some ways, it feels like a much more daunting journey that you're about to embark on than covering the space race. I mean, I never really thought about it this way until you just said this, but I think most people, when they think of human beings, they picture a head, arms, legs, organs, brain. But if you really get down to brass tacks, I mean, without the brain, the human being is nothing. It's a bag of flesh. The human is the brain. The brain is responsible for the room I'm sitting in right now, every plane that's ever been made, every rocket, everything that human beings have made throughout all of history is made by the brain. And yet the brain is like a untranslated Rosetta Stone that we haven't been able to figure out yet. But if we could unlock that Rosetta Stone that is the brain, we could understand all of humanity.
It's fascinating. I think it's so interesting that when I talk about getting more data, I mean, what's happening is we're about to be putting way more sensors into brains. Sometimes these brains are actually alive. And then we also have a whole host of new tools to study it and pull out all kinds of new data. And this is happening at the exact same time that we're building these artificial intelligence networks. And I think that AI networks are going to be, even though people call them neural nets, it's very vaguely brain-like. It just happens to be a lot of processing elements mushed together. I think we're about to learn the roots of our intelligence at the same time as we're developing a different kind of intelligence. I think these AIs are going to be like us, but not us. And it's a different kind of intelligence. To see and understand these two things at the same time, I think it's just going to be so fascinating. And it's going to raise so many questions about a lot of stuff you just said. I mean, yes, like our brain, without it, we don't have the planes and the house we're in and the table we're at. But it's just everything about how you perceive the world is your reality. This goes back to my philosophy classes. See, I was born to do this part, I think.
I'm thinking about all the distance we had to travel to get from the Wright brothers to sending reusable rockets into space, into low Earth orbit and beyond. And when I think of Elon Musk's Neuralink, and I think of Nolan Arbaugh, the first human patient.
I know Nolan. Yeah, I wrote the first story on him.
Yeah. I mean, is that, in terms of our progress, as you see it, is that like the Wright brothers plane? Where are we, do you think, in the timeline of our progress here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think of Nolan as kind of the first brain not. Yeah, I mean, it's both like incredibly exciting and moving fast, and also still does kind of feel like Wright brother-ish. Basically, what's happening is we've had similar tools in the past that have been used on mice and primates and very rarely on humans. And now we're entering this era where we're going to have electrodes. Nolan lives with these electrodes collecting data in his head all the time. That was impossible before. You used to maybe go to the hospital for a couple hours a week and they would read some data. And Nolan is just the first. Neuralink's going to implant more people. There's about 6 other brain implant startups doing very similar stuff. And so we're just at that moment now where we're going to start collecting all of this information. Meanwhile, there's a whole other raft of startups. We still cannot map at all, like all of the neurons and synapses, this massive connections in our head. The best we've really done is to map the entire brain of a worm and a fly and a tiny little chunk of human brain, about a cubic centimeter. And now there's new techniques coming very soon where we are going to be able to map the whole brain, create the equivalent of a human genome type thing of the brain, and really understand all the mechanics behind it. So all that's happening, these next 5 years will just be a flood of information. And the question is like, can we advance beyond there? How useful really is all this information? And this will be the first time we get to find all of that out.
Is that the use case of AI that most fascinates you right now in terms of how AI can interface with us inwardly, our human brains? Or is it an outside use case like ChatGPT or self-driving cars or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly AI that's at play in analyzing this flood of data that's coming out of the brain and trying to find these patterns. But no, I actually think what we've done with these large language models that are the basis of ChatGPT, pretty much any major AI system you're using today, is we mathematically solved language. We vacuumed up almost every single thing that's been written in human history, put all the statistics behind it, and now are able to mathematically predict how you should respond in language. I think this is quite different. I could be totally wrong, obviously, but I think this is a very different form of intelligence than what is inside the brain. So I'm not sure that these AIs are really going to crack the code on the mechanics of our mind. And that's why I was kind of saying, I think there's going to be 2 branches of intelligence that come out. And I think that people have been talking a lot about this AI alignment, trying to align these AIs to human wants and needs and morals and safety. And I suspect that will be very difficult to do because I think these neural networks are going to be so structurally different from the brain. I'm just not convinced we're going to have this overlap. I think we're off on 2 different tracks now.
I mean, that makes sense to me. How could we build something that we don't yet understand? I mean, how could you do calculus if you can't do multiplication?
Yeah, exactly. And then, it's only to complicate things further. There are people now trying to model entire human brains and then create a synthetic brain in software and have that do the alignment on these AIs. I mean, this is not like happening today, but there's a lab at Stanford that I know about that is setting out to do some of this work. And so there are people trying to bridge this gap. Lord knows if they'll be able to do it or not.
Speaking of the brain, to get personal for a sec, psilocybin, a lot of people would refer to it as magic mushrooms. It single-handedly cured my clinical depression, which I had been grappling with from 2009 to 2022. I mean, and grappling is using that term lightly. I'm talking therapy, SSRIs. I mean, it was a very intense, not fun time. And on the one hand, I don't want to throw out, the C word, the cure word around. But on the other hand, I have no way to describe the before and after of my experience. I mean, literally after the first time that I did psilocybin in 2022, by a few days later, my thinking had been fundamentally changed. And I bring that up because you've done hallucinogens throughout your life. You've done mushrooms, LSD. You've had a Chilean shaman burn holes in your arm and put frog poison in the burns. Looking back across all of these various hallucinogenic experiences, what are the big takeaways that you've learned about yourself that you otherwise may never have discovered?
Two things. So very first, just on what you're talking about and what we were talking about previously, I mean, to the extent that it's interesting to people, those very tools that I was talking about before, where we used to have to study a brain in a hospital or a clinical setting, these things are good enough, getting good enough now that people will be able to take hallucinogens and we will see exactly what happens in a brain when you take those. And I think we'll start to unlock a lot more answers around what these things do. But I don't want to encourage the children to do drugs. But I would say...
Cover your ears, children.
I would say the very first time that I took mushrooms, I think this is a common story that a lot of people have, which is you just get a sense, you're awakened to, again, some of the stuff we talked about before, the constructs that you have invented about the world, and to make it rigid and navigable and palatable to your sort of day-to-day, mechanics, well-being. You tune in to that part that you realize that your brain is constructing this reality and that there is something else there and that it doesn't have to be so rigid and everything people have told you isn't necessarily true and there are options and the world appears to work in quite mysterious, more flexible ways. I think of it as like the pulling away a bit of like the veil of ignorance and having a peek at a different reality. These things obviously can go wrong for certain groups of people. But yeah, I just found it very liberating and enlightening. And I don't do it all the time, but,
You're not on any right this moment, are you, Ashlee?
No.
Okay, thank goodness.
You probably get a better interview. No, but, every now and then, just like a little bit of a reset just to be reminded. I think it's almost like sometimes like a childlike before the world got its mitts on you and filled you with doubts and worries about yourself and all these things, and just to be reminded that you can be open-minded.
I want to share an experience that I had that is going to probably be a little embarrassing, but I want to share it because I'm hoping it'll get at something interesting. The very first experience I had with psilocybin was a pretty small dose. So most of what changed about my brain was happening in the background. I literally wasn't even aware that anything had changed until a few days later. And I kind of realized, oh, I'm not sad. But a couple years later, I had a much larger dose, something approaching a heroic dose is what they would say.
I was going to say, I thought we were going there.
I'm not going to go into too much detail, not because I don't think you would find it interesting, but for our listeners who've never done it, I think trying to describe what that's like is trying to describe to someone a dream you had, which is equally boring to be on the receiving end of. But I had this experience where I was just lying there and I was mostly being overwhelmed thinking about human connection and different ways that humans are connected to each other, how I'm connected to myself, how I'm connected to them. Have you found that your experiences on hallucinogens, be they mushrooms or otherwise, have affected you as a writer in terms of how you see your subjects, the people you're reporting about, how you relate to them, and how you relate to yourself as you write?
I think so. I've kind of thought about this on and off over the years. I mean, in a very practical sense, it made me read a lot of my favorite writers just being interested in this stuff. So I'm sure that got into my head. But I think it goes back to, I just tend to be a very open-minded person. And so I feel like I cut people a lot of slack, and I think it makes me like less judgmental. that is really the frame from which I begin any of these projects. And so does, I think, come through in my writing, and that I tend to try to present stuff rather than judge it. And I really do sort of think, some of it comes back from that, because I'm not interested in the boring and the normal and everybody doing the same thing. And so lots of people do hallucinogens these days, and so you can overgeneralize, but there is a little bit of a through line, I think, on some people who are inclined to maybe dabble with those kinds of things, being a bit more open-minded also in other facets of their life. I don't know exactly how it translates itself directly onto the page.
I imagine some of what you're describing was baked in, a part of your personality and character that you've had since you were small.
I think so. But then I think it kind of gets highlighted. And, I think you're also open to just weird ideas. There's this awesome guy. People can look him up. His name's Creon Levitt. He's in my book really briefly, but he used to work at NASA. He's brilliant. He has a whole talk. There's either a paper or a talk people can find about hallucinogens in this whole commercial space. They going back to what you were briefly mentioning. I mean, why people are sort of chasing this, and it seems like a lot of people in this industry do these things, and I think they identify with the great expanse above and the limitlessness of it all. And then I actually see this now repeating in the AI world. These researchers, these mathematicians, who I think would often be kind of stereotypically pigeonholed as, I don't know, what people would call nerds, they're also doing a lot of this stuff, and it has had influence on their AI breakthroughs. And so I think there's something we talk about. This is like mind expansion for a reason, and having new ideas. So, I think it's in keeping with the stuff that I'm interested in, which is pushing the frontier of human potential and technology.
Something you just said there, having an aversion, perhaps an extreme aversion to the boring. I mean, that is clear. That is a through line in your work in terms of what you cover as a writer, what you cover in Hello World, this new documentary, Wild Wild Space. But there's also something more there. I mean, just thinking about the upcoming Netflix movie you have about Brian Johnson, who, for our listeners, is spending millions of dollars a year trying to live as long as he possibly can. You wrote about Elon Musk, whose biography is probably well known to most, but the most, I think, singular thing that I can think of is that he made $175 million off the sale of PayPal in 2002, and then put the bulk of it into a new rocket company that's main mission was to get to Mars. And he put the rest of it in a fledgling EV startup that is now the most popular electric vehicle brand in the world. Then, of course, there's Peter Beck, who we've talked about. There's Chris Kemp. There's John Paul Stapp, a U.S. Air Force officer we talked briefly about, who built a rocket sled from scratch and then tested it on himself at 632 miles per hour, nearly killing himself in the process. And you're hoping, if he'll respond, to write a book about David Walsh, who is a professional gambler who bets $1 billion a year of his money on everything from blackjack to horse racing. You seem drawn to people who love to bet everything, whether it's their money, their career, even their life. Why?
I don't know anyone's ever presented it to me so explicitly before, and you just sold me on that case. Sometimes I do sort of wonder exactly what the through line is. I don't know exactly why, but I think it's like a life well lived. None of us get to be here very long. And if you're going to do this thing, go big. And I think I love the thrill of this binary outcome that looms over all this stuff in some ways, which is like, it either is the spectacular end result or this spectacular failure, and taking that risk to do that. I just find it really, obviously inspiring and fascinating to watch. I always tend to think everything I do is like a person on a quest, but I actually think you got to it a lot better than I've been thinking about it myself. But I don't know what the root, I have no idea where this came from or what the root of it is. I like to watch it happen.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about all those men. It's like people who love to live in the waiting room of a strictly binary result, whether it's spending all of your PayPal money on, I mean, literally one of the worst potential investments, building a rocket company in 2002 or 2003, or literally gambling your money on something incredibly risky like horse racing. There's a there.
And Brian is actually like betting his life on some of these things. So I mean, I think as a journalist, I'm in this luxurious position where I maybe don't have to make that same gamble myself, but I get to live vicariously through it and watch it and see how it goes for somebody else. And what better opportunity could you have than that? But there's things to be said for living nice, quiet lives and having a really wonderful family and friends around you and all that. I think I like just a bit more drama along the way.
Final question, Ashlee, to wrap us out. What's the biggest binary risk you've taken? Was it this movie? Was it Wild Wild Space? Was it something else? If you're looking at the subjects you cover and seeing those kind of binary risks they take, what would you say the biggest one you've ever done is?
In my professional life, when I started out to do the Elon book, he did not want me to do it. And he made that pretty clear, not in a horrible way, but he was making it clear it was not going to help. He didn't want me to do it. And I sold the book anyway to HarperCollins, thinking that making it real would force his hand and he would do interviews with me. And I went into his office and presented this to him. And then by the time I'd gotten home from our quite pleasant hour-long meeting, he'd emailed me and told me he was going to write a competing book and himself and beat me to market with his story and not participate. And so I had this moment. I remember I went on like a 8-mile run in which during that run, the entire time just going through my head was like, can I actually do this? If Elon Musk is actively trying to thwart me from doing a book while writing his own thing, should I even try to do this? And even more, like, do I need to return this bit of money I've gotten up front because this is all going to fall apart? And it sounds easy now in hindsight, I guess, but it was horrifying at the time. And it was a very binary decision. It's like, either you're going to do this or you're not. And I did it. And then, he ends up 2 years later agreeing to do interviews and the book is well timed. In my personal life, my wife and I had a long distance 3-year relationship and everything was falling apart, and she was living in Chicago and I was in San Francisco and all of our friends, I decided to move to Chicago to see if being in the same city would fix things. This is obviously before we were married, and every single person in both of our lives told us that was a horrible idea and not to do that, but it worked out. So here we are.
There's a lesson there. I mean, both of your examples had a fundamental cascading impact on the rest of your life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The wife, that's obvious, but had you literally gone the other way with that Elon book, there's no When the Heavens Went on Sale, probably. There's no Wild Wild Space.
And that one is big. I don't know if people know this, but journalists don't get paid a lot of money. And, that book happened to do quite well and really changed my family's, the outlook of our options. Anyway, no, you're exactly right. I mean, that was a singular, massive decision in my life.
Ashlee, you are a good read and you are a good talk. It is always a pleasure chatting with you, and I really appreciate you making the time today.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy this. This is my favorite show to be on, and you're so kind to actually dig into all this stuff. So I appreciate it.